else. And I want to tell you loud enough. You are, that's so good. The good country, and then I would like you to advise me about it. So good country is described a NGO or anything. Idea that consequences to that, but one of the most alarming consequences of it is that all of the problems in the world become globalized very rapidly and very effectively. So there are good things about globalization, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but let me talk about the bad things first. It's just possible some of you may have seen a TED talk I gave on this subject in 2014, and I used the example of pandemics to illustrate this. Pandemics is a relatively new phenomenon. There weren't too many pandemics until the middle of the 20th century, but now they've become much more frequent. And the reason for that, of course, is because of globalization. There's much more human contact, there's much more movement of people. And so what previously might have been a small, local, domestic problem can become a global problem very quickly, as we've seen with Zika virus in the upcoming Olympic Games. So, 100 years ago, if a chicken caught a cold and sneezed and fell over and died in a village somewhere in rural China, that would have been a problem for the chicken, of course, and for its immediate relatives. But it wouldn't have gone very much further. The disease would have run its course, and it would have remained more or less within the ambit of that village in China. Today, it can turn into bird flu, and it can travel all over the world. And it can become H1N1, or it can become something worse. And that model of the virus that becomes global is a very good model for the way that globalization works on all problems. If you take drug trafficking, for example, drug trafficking used to be a problem that was always international, but not truly global. And it consisted of pockets of activity in various different parts of the world, which were loosely but not absolutely connected. And therefore it was perfectly easy for individual countries and law enforcement agencies to tackle it and to keep it more or less under control. But with the rapid advance of globalization, just like H1N1, narco-trafficking becomes a global pandemic. The connections are so dense and so tangled and so interwoven that it's beyond the capability of any individual country to resolve it. So a country that's particularly badly impacted by narco-trafficking, like Mexico, for example, finds that it's completely unable to control the problem within its own borders because it's not within its own borders. And we've seen, as with the example of Colombia several years earlier, that if you are successful enough in stamping out drug trafficking in one country, it simply pops up in another country, which is part of the reason that Mexico is suffering so badly from it at the moment. The financial crisis is another classic example of the globalization of problems. A few years ago, or a few decades ago, if a bank had lent too much money and it went bust, that would be a problem for the bank, it would be a problem for the borrowers and for the lenders, but it wouldn't spread. Today, if a bank goes bust, and if the conditions are right, it can plunge the world into global financial crisis with spin-offs and consequences that we're still seeing today. So globalization is an extraordinary and wonderful thing, but at the point where I started working on this idea 2 years ago, it seemed to me that the current picture was that the globalization of problems had advanced much faster and much more success than the globalization of solutions. Now, we've been quite good at trying to create global solutions. We do have some multilateral institutions, the United Nations system and others, that do their very best to try to tackle some of these problems in a coherent, consistent and global way. But when you look at the problems, they appear to be way behind it. And over the last 15 years, I've been working as a policy advisor to the heads of state and heads of government of a number of countries, about 53 of them to date. And in the course of that work, I've had the opportunity to speak to a large number of experts around the world. experts in these kinds of problems, and what we've come to call the grand challenges. And I've spoken to the people who really know about climate change, and the people who really know about poverty and inequality, and the people who really know about pandemics and disease, the people who really know about drug trafficking and human trafficking and migration and terrorism and so forth. And I've got into the habit of always asking them the same rather stupid question, which is, do you know what the solution is to this problem? And every single one of them, I'm saying this without exaggeration, always replies, oh yes, we know what the answer is. And so I always say to them, well, so how come it's still a problem if you know the answer? If you know what the answer is, why aren't we fixing these problems? And they say, we don't have sufficient resources in every case. And I say, how come you don't have sufficient resources? And they say, because it's too big for any individual country to solve. And if we wanted to fix any of these problems, we would have to have much more cooperation and much more collaboration and sharing of knowledge and sharing of resources between nations, and they won't do it. They'll only do it sporadically or in a very limited or very superficial way. So I found myself thinking, if you wanted to summarize the problem of the world today, the reason why the world doesn't work, as simply and as childishly as you possibly could, then that, if you like, is the summary. That we live in a world of 21st century problems which are being tackled by basically 18th century nation states. And the nation state, in many ways, hasn't really updated itself, its view of itself, the way that it behaves with other nation states since the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia. There's really only one conception out there of what a nation state is and how nation states work together, which is a sort of neoliberal view that nations are inherently selfish, competing, warring entities, and that their job is to advance their own interests, if necessary at the expense of others. And collaboration is something you do as a last resort, when you absolutely have to, in order to avoid extinction. This is very unsatisfactory. And it's obviously quite wrong. It's quite inappropriate for the world that we live in today. So I found myself thinking, well, you could if you wanted to, and I could if I wanted to, spend the rest of my life focusing, as so many people do, on one or other of those challenges, like climate change, or poverty, or pandemics, or terrorism, or intolerance. And then I thought to myself, but actually, these are all just symptoms of the deeper underlying problem, that the culture of governance is wrong. The culture of governance is hopelessly out of date. Now, in my own work, advising these governments, I enjoy very good access. I talk to the people who run these countries very intimately about grand strategy. I talk to them about their hopes and fears for their own country over the very long term, and what is it they're trying to do. And for years I've been encouraging these countries to ask a very, very simple question when they think about grand strategy, when they think about the long-term role of their country in the world. And the question I'd always encourage them to ask is, what is my country for? Not what is my government for, which is to provide a certain standard of living for my people, and the usual answer, but what is my country for? What do we do, in other words, to deserve the space that we occupy on the Earth's surface? Or to put it another way, why should a random person in another part of the world feel glad that my country exists? What have we done for them? Because one of the questions I was asked most frequently by governments over the last 15 or 20 years were questions connected with the international standing, the reputation, the image of the country. And for a long time, that was the work that I mainly focused on. I had countries calling me all the time and saying, how can we improve our image? How can we make people admire us and like us more, so that then we will have more trade and we'll have more tourism and our exports will command a higher price on the global marketplace? And I always said the same thing back to them, which is, if people don't admire you, it's probably because you haven't done anything for them. And yet time after time after time, we see countries wasting enormous amounts of taxpayers' money on idiotic propaganda campaigns, telling the rest of the world how wonderful they are, and what a great standard of living and what a fine, noble history they have. and their beautiful landscapes and their advanced technology. And the rest of the world probably doesn't see any of this, but if they do, their only possible response could be, well, you must feel very pleased with yourselves. But what's it got to do with me? I don't care how successful your country is because I don't live there. And so I found myself repeating over and over again to these politicians, if you really want people to admire you, to admire your country, then you have to do something admirable. You have to make a difference to the world that they live in. And this was a question I've been researching for many years. In 2005, I started doing an annual survey that measures people's perceptions of different countries, what they think about them, what they believe about them, their prejudices. And what I discovered after 10 years of collecting this data every year, which had created an enormous database of more than 200 billion data points, was that if you analyzed that data set and you asked the data, why do people admire some countries more than other countries? The answer came back very clearly. People admire the countries that seem to do some good in the world, the countries that we feel glad that they exist. Take an example like Norway. Norway is one of the most admired countries on the planet, universally, not just in the West. Wherever you go, people admire Norway. Why is that? I mean, its reputation is way in advance of its real geopolitical impact, its real significance in the world. Why people admire it? Because they think that it's a good country. They think that it's a country that contributes something to the world that they live in. Because they vaguely heard of the Nobel Peace Prizes, which they think might be something to do with Norway. And they vaguely heard of the Oslo Peace Accord, which sounds like a really good thing. And Oslo is in Norway, isn't it, they think? And so they say, oh yes, Norway, that's a good country. And they don't worry about Norway. When they go to bed at night, they don't think to themselves, am I going to be woken up at 3 o'clock with Norwegian terrorists standing around my bed? And so generally speaking, it seems that there is a direct correlation between the amount that people admire a country and the degree to which that they believe that country is a contributor to the rest of the world. So this is very interesting. And over the years I've been saying this over and over again to these leaders. If you want to be admired, do something admirable. But I began to notice something quite interesting, that they never took my advice. And for some reason, it seemed to be far too difficult for them to make the decision and to execute the decision to actually start contributing something to the world in which they lived. Most of the time because they felt that their own voters, their own population, wouldn't stand for it. They were afraid that if they started focusing too much on doing stuff in the international domain, then their voters would think that they'd been abandoned, and that their voters would start complaining and saying, you worry far too much about poor people in Africa or poor people in South America, and you don't worry enough about us. And so they never, very seldom, actually did any of those things that I was recommending. So after doing this for about 15 years, and frankly failing, I began to think to myself, well, if these governments don't listen to me, then who will they listen to? And the answer is obvious. They'll listen to their own population. Not just in democracies. Tyrants listen to their own populations. In fact, tyrants worry more about what their own populations think than democratic leaders do in many, many ways. And so I thought to myself, perhaps if the people started demanding a different kind of leadership, then things really could change. Because it's one thing having an advisor like me saying to you, I think that it would make sense if you started thinking more about your country's role in the world. But it's quite another thing if that becomes one of the main issues when there are elections, and if that becomes one of the main things that citizens are demanding. So the question became, would citizens ever demand this of their leaders? Could you ever imagine a situation, for example, where, let's use the example of the United Kingdom since we're here today, where a large number of British voters started saying to shortly to be ex-Prime Minister David Cameron, when you go to the next G20 or the next COP, climate change summit, we don't want you just to come back with the best possible deal for us and screw everybody else. We want you to go there and be a good global leader and try and get the best deal for everybody. Of course for us as well, but for everybody. To be not just a good neighbor, but to be a good ancestor, so that we can feel more pride in where we come from. And I can walk around the world with my chin up and say, yeah, I come from Britain, we're a good country. We work for the common good. How many people would be prepared to say that to their leaders? And how many of them, on the other hand, would just say, naive, a nice idea, but it'll never work. Because in the end, people are selfish, aren't they? In the end, people are just selfish. All they really want is what's good for them. Well, I happen not to believe that second statement. I hear it 10 times a day from all over the world. I get people writing to me all the time saying, what you're doing is lovely, but it's fundamentally naive because people are fundamentally selfish. They only want what's good for themselves. I don't believe it. I've never seen any evidence of that at any point during my life. All my life, I've only seen evidence that in fact the opposite is true. That under the right circumstances, the majority of people are actually far from satisfied about being selfish. And they want to live in a community of people who help each other. The vast majority of people want that. And so it seems to me that there's a massive disconnect between governments and people. And every now and again something happens in the international domain which proves that disconnect. There was a wonderful example in Iceland, I think it was last year, when the Icelandic foreign minister announced that Iceland would be extremely generous and it would welcome something like 40 Syrian refugees in Iceland over the next few years. This is a typical statement from a Western government. And an Icelandic woman, I think she was a lawyer, said, not in my name. And she set up a Facebook page in which she said, we should take many, many more Syrian refugees. We've got the money, we've got the resources, we've got the space, and if we haven't got the accommodation, they can stay in my house. And if they can't afford to stay in my house, I'll pay for their plane tickets so that they can come to Reykjavik and stay with us until we've got somewhere else for them to go. And within, I think it was 72 hours, something like 60% of the population of Iceland were backing this and saying to the government, send them to my house if we're short of space. And the foreign minister had to back down and announce in public that actually they weren't going to take whatever it was, 40 Syrian refugees, they were going to take 4,000 or something like that sort. And from time to time we see examples of this. So I found myself thinking, now that's interesting, I wonder what sort of numbers we're looking at. So I turned to the World Values Survey, which if you've never looked at it, I do recommend it. It's a voluntary project which has been run every year for quite a few years now. And it's a big, big survey carried out in a large number of countries around the world, I think 48 or more countries. Big samples of people, asking a very, very long questionnaire about people's values, the things that they believe in. Questions about religion, about society, about work, about the role of men and women in society, and things of this sort. It's a very, very useful resource if you want to test the feeling of people and the way they look at the world. And out of their long questionnaire, I picked all of the questions that I thought would be revealing on this point. So for example, there's a question which says, if your government announced that they could give more help to poor people in poorer countries, but you would have to pay slightly higher taxes in order to do that, would you be prepared to take that hit for the benefit of other people? And there's always a minority of people, in some cases a substantial minority, it's a minority, but it's a substantial minority in some cases, who would say, yes, I would do that. And there are other questions of that sort. So what I did was I just ran together all of the results from those particular questions to try to estimate how many people in the world do basically have an international attitude, who basically think that they are human beings before they are citizens of their own nation, who don't have a problem with conceiving of the idea of humanity being one tribe, who like the idea of trusting in human nature, who would rather trust human nature than mistrust it, who have what you might call a naturally cosmopolitan outlook, who are excited by the globalized age that we live in. And I found that without a shadow of a doubt, there was a hard core of about 10% of the world's population that believe those values, that share those values, absolutely, 100%. The number that share some of those values to a certain extent is very much larger. We're getting into the 10s, 20s, 30s, 40% in some countries. In Sweden, it's actually 57% of the population, which is quite a remarkable statistic. But overall, on average, people who share those, what you might call cosmopolitan values, are 10%. And I thought to myself, well, 10 is quite a small percentage, but that equates to 700 million people, which is a very large number. So 700 million people in the world feel that they are human beings before they feel that they are citizens of their own nation. 700 million people fundamentally believe in the goodness of human nature and would rather trust people than mistrust them. They're not foolish or naive, some of them maybe, but the majority of them are not. They just happen to think that that's a better choice than mistrust and fear and selfishness. And I thought to myself, 700 million people, I don't wish to sound too aggressive about this, but 700 million people would be the largest army ever assembled if they were brought together in one movement and they knew that all the others were there. And so in 2014, I decided I would see if I could contact these 700 million people, reach out to them and say, here's who you are, and there are 700 million people just like you, and let's see what we can do. Let's see if we can change the way that government is done. Let's see if we can send out a message to our governments and tell them that things have changed. And the simple sentence that I use to try to encapsulate what this change might be is something I call the dual mandate. The idea is that for the whole of recorded history until now, anybody in a position of power or authority has got a single mandate, which means if you're in a position of authority, you are responsible for your own people and your own slice of territory. And it was very simple. That was your duty. And you had to look after the interests of those people and that territory. And if, in order to look after their interests, you had to screw somebody else, that was fine. Actually, that was rather good, because it showed you were very serious about looking after your own people. So if in order to give your own people a better standard of living, it was necessary to invade your next door neighbour, then that traditionally was regarded as being a sign of a really good leader. Well, it's strange, isn't it? But that's the way human beings are. My argument is that today, because of globalization, because of all of the stuff I was talking about at the beginning, everybody in a position of power and responsibility today has got a dual mandate. They've got two responsibilities. They have to look after their own people, yes, but also every single man, woman, child, and animal on the planet. They have to look after their own little slice of territory, yes, but also every square kilometre of the Earth's surface and the atmosphere above it. Now that sounds charming and delightful and totally impossible, doesn't it? And indeed, whenever I suggest this to politicians, the majority of them will say to me, that sounds charming and delightful, but I can't even look after my own parliamentary party, let alone 7 billion people who I've never met and who frankly don't vote for me. But the reason that they say that is because they are believing, and you can tell it from the way that they ask the question, that somehow those two things are incompatible, that somehow they're at odds with each other, that by definition anything they do for the good of their own people can't be for the good of the rest of the world, and that anything that they do for the good of the rest of humanity must be bad for their own people. They think that those two things are antithetical. And the fascinating thing is that they're quite wrong. They couldn't be more wrong. And one of the things that I've discovered, I've been very lucky having the job that I do over the last 15 years, is I've been able to experiment with real policies, real governments, and to see what works and what doesn't work. And what I've discovered is that there's a new form of governance, a new way of making policy that does actually unite very effectively your domestic needs and the needs of the rest of the world. I mean, I suppose climate change, sustainability is the most obvious example, and that's really shown us the way. You can do things that are right for your own population, that cut down pollution, but which are also good for the planet because they reduce the emission of greenhouse gases, and they generally give us a bit longer on this nice planet, which we've got so used to. But in 1,000 other ways, in almost every policy area, if you combine the international with the domestic interests, you will make better policy. So it's not a compromise. It's not an incredibly difficult compromise to try to find policies that somehow do some good for your own people and don't do too much harm for the rest of humanity. It's not like that at all. It's actually a way of harmonizing those two things that makes better policy. And the interesting thing is that industry actually discovered this back in the 1970s. Some management techniques came out of Japan in the 1970s that began to teach industry that cooperation, collaboration, and competition can actually exist together. And indeed, a word was coined for it. People called it co-opetition. And it's still used in industry today very successfully. This has been going on quietly in the background for 40 years. I'm the proud owner of a Tesla Model S. And the Tesla Model S is a miraculous piece of engineering. It's a very, very, very well-made and sophisticated car. And yet, it comes from an almost entirely new company. Now, how is that possible? How can a manufacturer get from 0 to 60? Sorry, I'm starting to become a bore. If you ever meet anybody who owns a Tesla, there's a danger that that's all they'll ever talk about, and you will become sick of it very quickly. It is not just the best car I've ever owned, it's the best thing I've ever owned. But the point about the Tesla I'm making here is that this is an almost entirely new company that managed to produce a very mature and sophisticated piece of engineering in an incredibly short time. How did they do that? Why? They did it by collaborating with their competitors. When I sit in my Tesla, most of the switchgear is made by BMW and Jaguar, who are two of their most serious competitors. They share technology, they share learning, and yet they're competitors. They want people to buy Teslas, they don't want them to buy Jaguars, but they're quite happy to collaborate on the design, on the production, on the sourcing of components and many other areas. And you know what? It works.
May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? The fire alarm system is about to be tested. Please take no further action.
Does that mean I don't have to?
May I have your attention, please? Fire has been reported in the building. Please leave the building immediately by the nearest exit. Do not use a lift. May I have your attention, please? Fire has been reported in the building. Please leave the building.
May I have your attention? So the consequence of that co-opetition is that it brings the whole industry sector forward. It helps all of them. And one of the things that I'm very interested in is the fact that this experiment, this co-opetition, which has been proven to work, has never really been tried outside industry. It's never really been tried at the level of governments. And so most governments just carry on with the idea that international and domestic are incompatible, and they never even try. So back in June 2014, I launched a new survey that I created. Well, it's not a survey, it's an index. It's called the Good Country Index. And the Good Country Index was an attempt to measure what I've been talking about. How much does each country on Earth actually give to the rest of humanity? This is a very difficult thing to measure because nobody had ever measured it before. You might well say, oh God, not another country index. I mean, there are hundreds of them out there, as you know. And almost every week you hear about a new ranking of countries. But the fascinating thing is that all of those indexes and all of those rankings are all, in one important sense, the same. What they do is they look inwards. They measure each country as if it were entirely isolated from the rest of the world. So there's a survey that looks at how prosperous countries are. There's one that looks at how transparent they are, how free they are, how stable they are, how happy their citizens are. Hundreds and hundreds of them. But they all take each country one at a time and look inwards, as if they were little islands inhabiting their own area in the middle of a vast ocean with no connection to the rest of the planet at all. But that's not the world that we live in. So what I wanted to do was to measure the other way around and say, I'm going to ignore what they do at home, because plenty of other people measure that. And if you want to find out how much transparency or stability or justice or prosperity or growth or productivity a particular country enjoys, there are 1,000 surveys out there which will tell you. But if you want to find out whether a country is actually good for the world, whether you should feel glad that that country exists, or whether it's a burden on the planet, there's no way of knowing. So I spent about 2 years with some people who are much cleverer than me, putting together a compendium of available statistics to try to estimate, or at least sample, what countries are giving to the world and what they're taking away. And in the end, we found 35 big data sets, which are mostly from the UN system. The reality is, when you start looking for reliable measurements of how countries behave, large numbers of countries, there's actually not very much data out there, because only organizations like the United Nations have got the resources to do that kind of measurement on that kind of scale. But we did find 35 data sets, which were in a number of areas, like peace and security. How many people do you kill outside your borders every year? And you lose points if you kill people outside your own borders. Do you export weapons outside your own borders? And if you do that, you lose points. On the other hand, if you sign international treaties promptly, like the Treaty for the Rights of Disabled Persons, and you don't mess around and you sign it within a year or so, then you win a point or two. And if you're up to date with your contributions to UNESCO, then you win a point or two. Or rather, you lose a point or two if you're not up to date with them. And if you send a lot of doctors out to medicine, a point or two. If you send out volunteers, if you receive a lot of migrants, you gain some points. If you emit a lot of migrants, you lose points, and so on and so forth. A lot of these data sets are, in some senses, doubtful. You could argue about them for days on end, and we spent 2 years arguing about all of them. And from the day we launched it, I've done nothing but argue with strangers about them. And I get people writing to me every single day of the week saying, how can you possibly say that seizing a ton of cocaine is a bad thing to do? Or how can you possibly say that CO2 emissions are a way of measuring the harm that a country does, since climate change is obviously a liberal plot to deceive us all, and so forth. Some of these people are obviously unwell, but quite a lot of them are not, and they're just having perfectly valid objections to what is in the end an experiment. And sometimes when I've got the time, I do engage in the discussions with them, because they're always fascinating discussions. This is a very difficult thing to measure. But most of the time, in order to cut short the discussion, I say, the fact that we are having this conversation shows that the index is working, which is a very annoying thing to say, I know, but it does end the conversation. Because the fact is that all I really wanted to do was not to provide a complete and exhaustive measurement of what each country on Earth contributes to the global commons, because that would be impossible. What I wanted to do was to suggest a new way of thinking about countries. And the fact that people are writing to me and saying, my precious country contributes far more than you say, or this country which I hate contributes far less than you say, we're already having a new conversation. They're still biggers, but we're still having a new conversation. Because instead of asking how well countries are doing, we're asking how much countries are doing. And that's a new conversation. And it's the conversation that needs to be had. What is our contribution? What are we giving? And what are we taking away? So that's the good country. And there's lots more about the good country which you can see if you want to look it up. I wish you would. We have the best URL. It's www.good.country. .country is one of the new top-level domains. I'm sure you're aware of that. So there's no com or go or anything like that. So good.country is where you can read about it, and it's a more highly developed philosophy and way of looking at the world than the little sketch I've given you now. But those are the basics of it. It's basically about trying to establish that idea of the dual mandate, that leaders have got responsibility for everybody, and the sooner they recognize that, the better. I suppose in a sense, one of the things that I'm trying to do is I'm trying to defeat the idea of nationalism, because I think it's a very, very toxic and dangerous idea. The most dangerous attribute of humanity is its desire to form tribes and to have those tribes fight against each other. It's very destructive, and it doesn't really get us anywhere. I'm not saying that competition is a bad thing. Of course, that would be absurd. Competition is deeply ingrained in all of us. It's part of human nature, and competition has been directly responsible for creating a lot of the prosperity that we've seen over recent decades. But competition becomes a problem when it's the only God that you worship. And what I think has really been the problem of the world over the last 50 to 80 years, where a lot of things have really started to go wrong, and they really have, is because we have worshipped at the altar of competitiveness and forgotten everything else. And that's not very wise. I think wisdom consists in understanding that you have to mix your competitive instincts with a good deal of collaboration and cooperation. And they do mix, as I said before. So this is the change that we need to see. We need to see a change in the culture of governance, so that governments, and also, I'm not just talking about the people who run countries, I also mean the people who run cities and the people who run corporations, realize that the agenda has changed. And I would like to see nationalism and localism one day become as taboo and as old-fashioned as racism and sexism have started to become in large parts of the world. Let me explain what I mean by that. If you were sitting in a city council meeting almost anywhere in Europe, just for example, 30, 40 years ago, you would probably have heard the men around you, and they would have been predominantly men, of course, occasionally punctuating the conversations with sexist or racist remarks. And they would have been debating things like employment, and they would have said, but if we do that, then all the jobs will go to women. As if that were a bad thing, and everybody would agree that that would be a bad thing, and nobody would dispute it. Or else they would say, if we do that, then all the jobs will go to foreigners. And everybody would say, well, that's a bad thing. Or they might even say, all the jobs will go to people with different coloured skin than us, as if that were a bad thing. And everybody would nod and say, you're right, well, we need to avoid that happening. 30 or 40 years ago. Even today, in many countries, you'll still hear those kinds of conversations. But in a large number of countries, if you say something like that today, you won't only lose your job, you'll go to jail. And a good thing too. But you can still make nationalist comments, and indeed you can still be encouraged to. Shortly to become new Prime Minister, Theresa May has been saying non-stop, ever since she was appointed the Prime Minister of Great Britain, I will do what is best for Britain. I will do the right thing for us. I will make sure we don't lose competitiveness against other countries. I will make sure that jobs don't go to people in other countries. I will make sure that we do better than the rest. I will do the best for you. And it doesn't occur to anybody that there's anything wrong with saying that. But if you think about it for 5 minutes, you'll realize it's deeply, deeply wrong. It's completely the wrong thing to be saying in a globalized world. What she should be saying is, I will do the right thing for everybody, and I will make you proud to be British because we're a country that is doing the right thing for everybody. But it would never occur to her to say that. It would never occur to most politicians to say that, because it's just not the standard monologue. And sometimes I feel as if I'm the only person in the room. I was listening to a radio show on the BBC the other day, and it was one of those ones where they were talking about employment. And there were 4 people from different parts of the political spectrum, from the extreme left to the moderately extreme right, and they were all giving their own recipe for how we could create more jobs, which in itself, if you ask me, is a rather 19th century idea, but leave that aside. And they were all giving their own prescription for how we could create more jobs. Every single one of those people, I think there were 5 of them, every one of them, I'm not kidding, at the end said, and if we don't do this, what I've just suggested, then all the jobs will go to China. They all said it. And I was screaming at the radio, and I was saying, who said it was a bad thing for Chinese people to have jobs? How can you stand here and say it's a bad thing for people in China to have jobs? Don't people in China need jobs just as much as people in England? Why should we be fighting? We're trading with them every day. The jobs that we have probably depend on trade with China at some level. So how is this illogical disconnect still functioning? But of course, the moment hasn't come. But the moment is coming. And it's going to get to the stage pretty soon where people will begin to realize that actually you can't get away with saying things like that, because it's stupid, and it's ignorant, and it's dumb, and it's suicidal. So all of this sounds very difficult and very ambitious because I'm talking about cultural change. I'm not talking about systems change. But in my experience, cultural change is easier than systems change. I was lucky enough to witness a change in the culture of governance begin to take place just a few years ago. I was an advisor to the King of Bhutan when the idea of gross national happiness started emerging as a meme around the world. Of course, gross national happiness is quite an old idea. It had been around since the 1970s. But only much more recently did Bhutan start recognizing that this was an idea that was correct for the rest of the world, that it was an idea whose moment had come. And within a matter of months, I started to hear politicians all over the world starting to talk about happiness. Gordon Brown, who was then the Prime Minister of Great Britain, gave a speech here in London in which he said that as Prime Minister of Britain, the most important thing he had to promise to his voters was not prosperity, but happiness. And this was an extraordinary thing to say. If he'd said that in a speech 6 months earlier, he would have been laughed off the stage. But because this idea had come along out of Bhutan, that actually in the end, getting richer and richer and richer isn't the most important thing, What ultimately matters is how happy people are. It's a very sensible notion. Suddenly, it had changed the culture of governance worldwide. If not the culture, certainly the vocabulary. And very often the vocabulary changes. I think that that is a very sensible idea. It seems perfectly extraordinary to me that humanity has taken tens of thousands of years to figure this one out. But there you go, we are a little bit slow on the uptake sometimes. But I think that the idea of going from wealth to happiness was a stage in the development of humanity. It's not the end of it. And now we have to understand that just being happy and wanting to be happy is just as selfish and just as suicidal as wanting to be rich. Because if you're the last person on earth, it doesn't matter how happy you are, because in the end, it's of no value. And so I suppose the question we should be asking ourselves now is not how rich am I going to be, or even how happy am I going to be, but how happy are we going to be collectively, which in fact is what the Buddhists really mean when they talk about gross national happiness. It's a collective happiness of society. And that's what we will get on the global level if we proceed the right way. Okay, so I'm beginning to bore myself. I will tell you about my latest project, and then I want to ask your advice about it. So lots of people, very sensibly, when I took the time to explain the good country to them, they seemed to like it very much. I had a lot of people saying to me, this is a really lovely idea, and I would really like to support this. And I guess that those people were up from amongst the 700 million, those naturally cosmopolitan people. By the way, the people who are not part of the 700 million, it's immediately obvious that they're not. Those are the people who write me emails, and I get 2 or 3 of those every week, saying, you are fucking crazy. And they're often very, very aggressive. And they say, they accuse me of Marxism, of fascism, of one world government, totalitarianism, just every big word that they can ever think of and hurl it at me. And say, not just this is incredibly naive, but this is incredibly dangerous. So the idea of people being a bit nice to each other is incredibly dangerous. Now, I've been reading up on psychology to try to understand what's going on here. And I discovered, many of you may be familiar with this already, I discovered the existence of a concept called right-wing authoritarianism. And if you have a moment to look it up, there's a wonderful psychologist, he's American, lives in Canada, called Bob Altermeyer. Don't ask me how you spell that. And he wrote a fantastic book, which is available as a free download on the web, which is called The Authoritarians. I think that's the name of the book. Anyway, it's Bob Altermeyer. And I read this book, and I read it without stopping. It was the most fascinating thing I'd ever read in my life, because it wasn't written in an academic style, but he is a serious academic. And he explained this personality type of the right-wing authoritarian. Right-wing does not mean right-wing in the traditional party political sense of the word. He explains why the term is used. But it's basically people who feel that the world is a threatening place, and have done ever since they were little. It's very likely that some of you feel that way as well. And that your job, and you've believed this since you were little, is to defend yourself against the threat that surrounds you. And lots and lots of people have that view for one reason or another. And therefore, the idea of trusting in human nature and believing that people, the majority of people, are basically to be trusted, to them feels like a very, very dangerous idea and a very frightening idea. And those are the people who, in enormous numbers, will vote for Donald Trump, or for Nigel Farage, or for Marine Le Pen, or for Norbert Hofer, or for any of these narrow-minded populist leaders, because they will say, I understand your anger, I understand your fear, and we will fight back. And that appeals to that particular mindset. I think it's wrong. I don't necessarily judge those people, because it's a personality type more than anything else. But what's so very interesting, remember what I said right at the beginning about how globalization has globalized the problems more than the solutions. The rise of these populist parties is another excellent example of what happens in globalization. We all know, if you look at history, we know what happens in times of stress, particularly if it's economic and social stress. What happens is that narrow-minded nationalist populist politicians emerge and get very large followings. And they sometimes even get elected, because what they're very, very good at is reflecting the fears and the anger of the population back on them and saying, I understand, I feel your fear, I feel your anger. Beppe Grillo in Italy is a wonderful example of this. He mimics the fear and the anger of the population straight back at them. And they love this because they feel he's the only person who understands them. Trump is the same. He mirrors the anger and the fear of the population back at them, and they love him because they feel he's the only person who understands them. And they vote for these people. Now, normally, typically, in history, we find that those people, if they are elected, don't stay in government, in power, for very long because they don't know how to run countries. And they only really have one idea in their head. But one should always be alert to the possibility that they might know how to run countries. And they might achieve so much power that their doctrine of fear and paranoia will end up being the official national doctrine. But the interesting thing about globalization is that, of course, those financial, those economic and cultural, societal stresses have become universal. So migration, which is the classic societal stress, is now a universal global problem. And economic crisis, which is the classic financial stress, is now global. So it's not just people in one country being short of money and being worried about migrants. It's most people in most countries being worried about having no money and there being too many migrants. And the consequence of that is that this upsurge of nationalist politicians isn't just in one country, it's everywhere. Wherever you look around you, you will see these kinds of leaders emerging. And the fascinating thing is that nowhere in the world is there any single coherent counter-narrative to that nationalism, to that narrow-minded politics of fear and paranoia and mistrust and hatred. There isn't one. And that's because the old political system doesn't provide one. The existing political system is basically the Marxist idea that you have two warring tribes in society, capital and labor. You have left wing and right wing, and that's the way that most political systems are organized. And that really isn't the issue anymore. It really isn't the issue. And you see what happens during the Brexit referendum, that the real issues that the population are worried about and use the referendum to vote on are nothing to do with capital and labor. They're nothing to do with left wing and right wing. They're purely to do with responses to globalization. You have one tribe on one side of the barrier who basically feel inclined to look inwards and backwards because that's where they find comfort and solace and hope. And you've got another tribe who look forwards and outwards because that's where they find comfort and solace and hope. And those are the tribes. Those are the issues. And conventional politics of left and right is totally lost in that because it's got nothing to do with whether you're capital and labor. And people try to force it into that mold, but it doesn't work. So there's no political opposition to nationalism. What is the opposite of Norbert Hofer? In Austria, it's ended up being sort of the Green Party. But why? It could just as well be the Social Democrats. It could be any party. But the problem today is that people have lost faith in the traditional parties. So this kind of narrow-minded nationalism is enjoying an almost free run because there's no existing political movement that directly countermands it or directly contradicts it. So, as I was saying, the good country seemed to be an idea that people liked as long as they were part of the 10%. And they were very keen to help. But they constantly wrote to me and said, what do we do? What can we actually do if we want to get involved with this? So I realized that sooner or later I would have to get to grips with reality and I'd have to come up with something that they could actually do. So I cooked up an idea which was designed to be quite provocative and quite interesting, which is called the Global Vote. And the Global Vote is exactly what it says. It enables anybody in the world to vote in other countries' elections. Now, this has never been possible before, but we have a thing called the internet, which makes it possible. So if you are somebody living in Japan, and you happen to think that the person who is elected to be the next president of Iceland might possibly have an impact on your life, you can go to the Global Vote and you can vote. Your vote will not be counted, let me state the obvious, in the Icelandic election because you're not an Icelandic citizen, but I'm going to be counting it. And if we achieve our aim, which is in every single election that we cover, we get more people outside the country voting than there are people inside the country voting, then we have a clear majority and people have bloody well got to pay attention. So the principle of the thing is really very, very simple. We live in a totally connected world today. Anything that happens in any country is sooner or later going to have an impact on other people in other countries. There's no doubt about that. And yet, the people in other countries cannot vote. on who runs those other countries. So there is a complete democratic vacuum at the international level. There is only democracy within countries. Above the level of the nation state, there's none. So we don't have a choice. We have absolutely no control. The Brexit referendum was the perfect example. The decision as to whether Britain remained in the European Union or left was a decision which was going to have a profound impact on the lives of many, many hundreds of millions of people around the world. But only 40-odd million British people were entitled to vote on it. And in some senses that's right, because it was their decision, it was about their membership of the Union. Nonetheless, the impact would be enormous, and nobody else would have a say in it. They just have to sit down and cross their fingers and hope that the Brits made whatever they felt was the right decision. Strikes me that this isn't great. And it would be really nice if those hundreds of millions of people could at least express their opinion, at least have the opportunity to, in some sense, petition the British voters and say, remember us, because we're going to be affected as well. This is not just about you, this is also about us. And then the real voters in Britain would have a little bit of extra information, which is terribly important. And in the same sense, when the Icelanders are electing their next president, it's really, really good if people around the world say, you think you're just Iceland, you think you're very, very small, but depending on who your next president is, that could affect us. If you have another economic and financial crisis, that's going to impact us again, because it did last time. If we insist on allowing you to keep volcanoes that you obviously don't know how to look after, and another one of them goes off again, that will have a severe impact on air travel and consequences of a large number of countries near about, and that's going to impact us. At the moment, we've just opened the elections in the Republic of Sao Tome and Principe, which, as I'm sure every single person in the room knows all about. It's a small island nation in the Gulf of Guinea, and they're about to elect their new president later on this month. So we're covering that one. And that to me is a fascinating example of the world that we live in today. This is a nation of barely 100,000 people. And most people out there, not in here, have never heard of Sao Tome. They have no idea where it is or why it should matter. And when I say to people, you should be expressing your opinion about who should be the next president of Sao Tome, they look at me as if I'm completely bonkers. But actually, it only takes 5 minutes to explain why in the modern world it could make a big difference. If the next president of Sao Tome happens to be somebody who looks inwards and doesn't care about the rest of the world and wants to cut them off from the rest of the world, that will impact us. More Sao Tomeans will start leaving, it will produce more migrants, which we, other countries, have to host. Their economy will probably start to tank, and that means that other countries will have to provide more aid. If they start emitting more waste, and they start polluting the oceans or the atmosphere, then that's our oceans and that's our atmosphere. Or perhaps they'll pick somebody for the next leader who will be the next Nelson Mandela. Great leaders can come from any country. Very often they'll come from very small, insignificant countries. But because they are a head of state or a head of government, people listen to them. Even if you're the head of state or the head of government of a tiny nation, people will listen to you. And the world needs great leaders. And a great leader could come from absolutely anywhere. So in every single case, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get more people outside the country voting in the elections than there are people inside the country. Because every time that happens, the world has changed a tiny bit. Now, the one that people, of course, are getting quite excited about is a little show that'll be going on November the 8th called the Donald and Hillary Show. And I want to get more people outside the United States voting on the outcome of that election than there are registered voters inside the United States. I'm not sure what the number is. They'll probably have a larger turnout than usual. It might be 140 million people. So we need to find 140 million and one people outside the United States who want to vote on the outcome of the presidential election in the United States because they know it's going to affect them and they want their voice to be heard. They want their choice to be registered in some form, even if it's not official. Luckily, Donald has done me a huge favor by reaching out and insulting 120 million Mexicans. So I reckon that we shouldn't have too much trouble in getting a few million Mexicans to vote on the outcome of that particular election, and probably quite a few Canadians as well. Most of the world's Muslims, come to think of it, and so forth. But here's the question. This is such a, I was going to say, crazy idea. It's not really a crazy idea, but it's a slightly unusual idea. The trouble with this kind of slightly unusual idea is that it's enormously difficult to get people to support it. And when I say people, I mean companies, foundations, the kinds of powerful friends you need to have if you're going to make something like this really succeed on a really big scale. The only way this is going to work is if we get hundreds of millions of people around the world, ordinary people, saying, wow, that's cool, I'd love to vote in that election. The trials that we've done so far just to test the platform in Iceland and Brexit showed very clearly that people who do it enjoy it very much and they get quite excited about it. But getting the message out to the hundreds of millions of people who have no idea that it exists and still have no idea why they should do it, that's the real challenge. So that's the point at which I stop talking and I hand over to you and I say, what do you think? If you were to draw the map of connections from each of you to all of your friends and your networks, and from their networks out to their networks, within a very few steps, we'd find that we were in the tens or even hundreds of millions. That's the way that networks work, and we all know that. What would be the mechanism for getting them involved in this? How would we incentivize people, not just to vote themselves, but to pass on the word? Because if 146 million of us around the world vote in the US elections, then we are officially unignorable, and the world, as I said before, has officially changed. So, any thoughts, please put up your hand and let me know. So.
Thank you very much for your valuable presentation, experience, and thoughts. My name is Ibrahim Fahmi, Middle Eastern Egyptian, working for major oil company as always. Actually, I would like you to do a big survey on a very good example about globalization and the something bigger change happened in system, in people, in culture, which is the football. You know, in the final Euro, 80% of players is born outside Europe, actually from Africa. Okay, and if you will ask anybody in Europe 25 years ago, do you imagine that in one day that would happen to you? You are crazy. Okay, even the system not allows that. The government not allows it. Even if you could remember in UK, even for foreign football players, it's not easy to get the World Cup. Okay, and if you and even limited for 3 players after some changes. So yes, this big change happened, and even the fans accepted that, and even the technical manager of the national team being from other countries.
Okay, so we stop you there, so we give other people a chance. Thank you very much. So sport is a really, really good idea. It's very international, and I agree with you 100%. I think everybody in the world has got a gene in their body that lights up when they see people from different countries playing together, competing. And there's a wonderful metaphor in sport as well for what we're talking about here. Life on Earth is a team game. It's not a sprint, right? So individual countries who think they're Usain Bolt and they're going to win are deluded, right? Life on Earth is a team game. And doing that through sport, I think is a really, really cool idea. So any ideas about the mechanism? You don't have to give them to me now, by the way. I hope that we can create an ongoing dialogue. I want you all to feel free to write to me. I always answer emails. It may take a week or two sometimes to answer them. But I would really, really value your thoughts on email if we don't have a chance to discuss them today. My email address is simon@good.country. I'm not going to do this microphone thing. Would you? Simon@good.country.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to start at the back and then maybe we can just move the microphone forward.
Have you thought about Facebook?
Yes, all the time.
That would be, like, to me, a very logical thing.
Yeah.
Videos go viral all the time, and
Yeah.
if you make a nice one with a clear message,
Yeah.
and you share it,
Yeah.
that could go like into the millions.
Yes.
How's the first ones?
Yeah, Facebook for sure. One of the things that we did notice is that putting the global vote on a website did make it harder for a lot of people. Kids, particularly these days, they don't go to websites. They stay on Facebook all day. And so unless the thing is a native Facebook application, it's unlikely to get all that much attention. So that's something that I'm looking at. The problem that we've got at the moment is that stuff like that costs money. You know, we need to build the app and make it work. Require you to pay app that might be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people on it. But certainly we are looking into that. Anybody who's got any suggestions about how we can get this thing moved onto Facebook, I think that would make a huge difference. And it needs an app as well, by the way. Who's got the mic?
Hi, I'm Young. I'm Kia from South Africa. My response to that is I've seen there's a lot of movement around social media and a lot of people are gaining a lot of information. The problem with that is that there's a lot of public consumer social media slacktivism where people press like and they share it, but no real action takes place. I think we need something beyond social media that actually gets people together, taking part in something. I think the WWF Foundation was trying something similar where they were actually using tweets to get people to donate money.
Right.
So by tweeting one of the endangered animals, $2 would be donated to the organization. I think we need something further than just sharing and likes.
Thank you very much for saying we. I'm so flattered that you're already saying we. I think that's so cool. Because this is really not my idea. This is our idea, it's everybody's idea who wants to participate, otherwise it's never going to work. Let me just say very, very briefly in response to that. Yes, I'm aware of the problem of slacktivism, but I'm going to be very practical about this. Because we're unfunded, because we have no strength, because we don't have any powerful friends, the best way that we can catch the attention of big media and big funders and so on and so forth is just by having big numbers. So my feeling is that if in the first year, and particularly for the US election, we get those numbers in a way that isn't about real deep engagement, and it is people just saying, oh yeah, Donald, or oh yeah, Hillary, I don't really mind. Because then we've got them, and we've got the numbers, and we've got the profile, and then we can start working on the core of those who really do want deeper engagement and want to actually read about the candidates and want to do more different good country stuff later on. So I think we have to be pragmatic about it. One thing that's become very clear to me now is that if you really do want people to engage deeply in the elections of Zambia, which are about to start covering, they have to spend hours reading about the candidates, looking into it properly, and most people are not prepared to do that. But over time, you never know. If they like it enough, they may learn to do that. So I think it's got to be staged. Who's got the microphone? Who else got the microphone? Seth.
Hi there. My name is Mark. I'm from Edinburgh. So we recently obviously had a referendum in the UK, which in many respects was a referendum on globalisation. And we had a very low turnout for that referendum, and the turnout that it was very much divided along, sort of between a more educated, outward-looking segment of the population, and perhaps a more inward-looking, sort of nationally focused part of the population.
It was a pretty good turnout, actually. It was higher than
it was worse than the Scottish referendum. My point is that you're sort of asking us, we could try and sort of network this, and we could pass it on, and we could get to other people. Without making any presumptions about the people who come here today, I'm going to say that our mere presence here shows that we're also quite attuned with international affairs and interested in those affairs. So all we would be doing really would be reinforcing that existing divide that already is between a certain educated, globalized elite and a less educated, less globalized mass. And so people start voting in our elections, will we not simply get the opinions of that same elite rather than the kind of mass participation that I think you're driving for?
Yes. A very similar answer to the lady from South Africa. At the beginning, yes. But frankly, what we need is traction. And if we're going to get traction from the hardcore of natural supporters, people like us at the beginning, that's fine. I'm not going to worry too much about bias right at the very beginning. The important thing is that we get a bigger movement going. And then, of course, those kinds of issues start to become very real, which is then how can we reach out to people who don't feel part of this? I mean, I've often said from the very beginning, I would rather have 10,000 ordinary people in Bangladesh voting on this than 100,000 TED-watching activists in North America, because frankly, not to diss the TED-watching activists in North America, but they'll follow anything that sounds vaguely liberal. In the British sense of the word. So later on, but I think we have to get the numbers and the momentum and the traction first wherever we can find it. And the low-hanging fruit, if I can call us that, is probably the obvious way to start. Does that make sense?
May I have your attention, please?
Oh, yes.
May I have your attention, please? The fire alarm test is now complete. Thank you for your cooperation.
Okay, who's got the microphone?
My name is Eunice. I am from Ghana. I work with women and children in rural Ghana. And as a follow-up to what he was saying, I think middle-income class people have a tendency to become indifferent to these issues. Whereas the low-income, those who suffer, from the decisions that we make, they are looking for the opportunity to get involved. And so if we can shift it, find a way to get them, and I think that's because, like you said, all of us here are actually like internationally attuned. So you kind of get the same people, without reaching the majority of people. I'm suggesting, as a way of incentives, I'm suggesting that you see these people, rural people who have do not have access to a lot of resources, they are looking for the opportunity to learn. They are looking for the opportunity to be connected. And so if we can, motivate them by giving them the opportunity, after they have done good in their countries, if we can give them the opportunity to come, travel outside and then get the exposure, just like I have today, I think that will go a great way on both sides.
Okay, thank you, Eunice. I just want to pick up on one word of what you said there, which was all very, very true. You said the opportunity to learn. And one of the things that I've observed from the very beginning of this project is that the most natural supporters of this are people between the ages of 16 and 25. They tend to be high school kids and undergraduates because they're not yet worried too much about, family responsibilities and housing and all the rest of it, and they tend to be still quite idealistic. They're not too cynical. Some of them are, but the majority of them have still got quite open hearts. And those are the people who love this, and that's where the numbers are going to come from. So I've got about 30 or 40 volunteers around the world at the moment who've got connections to schools and universities. And one of the things that we're trying at the moment is to use this as an educational tool. So here's a suggestion. If you have access, if you can teach a class in a school or a university, it's a really simple formula. You pick on a country, depending on your students, it could be that the country that will most turn them on is a country they've never even heard of before, like Sao Tome, or it could be a country that they're already fascinated by, like the United States. You teach a class on that. The information is easy to find. What are the issues? Who are the candidates? Why are they having an election? What could the outcomes be? You take a look at how that country ranks in the Good Country Index. That will give you loads of detail about its impact on the rest of the world, positive and negative. How might that change depending on which of the candidates get elected? And then at the end of the class, they all vote together. And if they're 15 years old, they can vote. The lowest age for voting on the Global Vote platform is 4 at the moment, and I'm considering reducing that. So all of the teachers who've tried this have come back to me and said this is an amazing educational resource because A, we're getting them interested in other countries, in the geography and the history and the politics of other countries, and the differences between us and them. B, we're getting them interested in democracy and voting systems, and we're giving them the experience of what it actually feels like to vote in an election, and not even your own election. And C, most importantly, we're teaching them the values of interdependence. We're teaching them about how countries all depend on each other. And I think that that has the potential to be viral, to go through the educational system around the world. So one of the things I don't want to restrict it to that, but it seems to me that that's a really, really hopeful direction. I have one teacher at a university in Bangladesh at the moment who's saying that she's prepared to give course credits to the students who bring in other students and vote. She's lucky enough to work in a university where that's fairly informal anyway, and she says, I'm giving them 15 course credits if they put up a stall and get 18,000 students to vote. So these are the kinds of things that we need. In Europe, you wouldn't be able to do that, but there may be other ways of doing it. Who's next? Are you going to be doing the microphone for me? That's really kind. Lady there.
Hi, I just want to go back to kind of the divide of people from after the Brexit referendum.
Yeah.
And I think that there is a tendency for us to think that people who voted Labour are inward looking, that they may be even sometimes racist, but I think that it's a really big generalisation because often and mostly these people have suffered enormously from the consequences of the financial crisis, of globalisation, and they're suffering with poverty, inequality, unemployment. And I think it's those people want someone to help them through their troubles. It's very easy for people who already have jobs, who are doing very well, to look outwards and look internationally. But those people aren't those people, they are suffering. And they need someone to stand up for them. And I think it's difficult to be internationalist when there are so many people with those opinions.
Yes. I agree with you to a considerable extent. I find it very difficult to form strong opinions about things. The older I get, the harder I find it. Unusually, when it came to the Brexit referendum, I had a very, very strong opinion that we should not leave the European Union, because I have a lot of respect for the EU. In fact, I've often said in public, the European Union is the noblest experiment in the history of humanity, because you've got all these countries who voluntarily decided that collectively they would be better off. But since then, a lot of people have pointed out to me, I think quite fairly, that the European Union is itself very inward-looking. And it is actually quite protectionist, and it is actually quite narrow-minded. Okay, 28 countries is a whole lot better than one, but still, it's the mindset that matters, not the numbers. And since the Brexit referendum, yeah, I grieved for 3 or 4 days, and I felt that I didn't belong in this country anymore. But you've got to move on. And I found myself thinking a lot of the things that you've just said. And predominantly, maybe in the end we will pull through. Because actually, if it really is what the government are claiming, that this country is now going to be extra vigorous at pursuing much wider engagement with a much wider world, the Commonwealth, I wonder how many people in the British government ever actually use that word in an average week. We are, after all, a member of the Commonwealth of Nations. It's about 1/3 of humanity. It's potentially so many things that it just has given up being long ago. Much bigger than the European Union, much more interesting, much more diverse, and so on and so on. So I think there's plenty of hope there. Whenever the jigsaw puzzle is thrown up in the air, you've got a few minutes to rearrange the pieces before they fall down again. And this could end up being a move forward. I entirely take your point about the people who feel left behind by globalization. And I also entirely understand what you mean about them not looking outside, because their problems feel very local. The reality is that the solutions are from the outside because of the globalization of trade and finance and everything else. The reason they've lost their jobs is very likely, in many cases, because of botched responses to globalization on the part of the government. And so I think it may well be true that their first response would be to say, I don't care about rich people, I don't care about foreigners, I want to keep the foreigners out, they're the problem. But they're wrong, that's not the problem. And I think that the solutions are going to come from a wiser and fairer approach to the forces of globalization rather than a retreat from it. That's an opinion I hold, and I don't think I'm going to change my mind on that anytime soon. You decide, you're Mr. Democracy. There's a lady just there at the back who's please. Okay.
Hi, I'm Harrison from the UK. You said that you oppose, or you're critical of localism and nationalism in big decision making. But do you not think that there's an inherent logic to localism when it comes to representation of people and places that wouldn't normally have a voice in, big government decisions? And is there not an empirical advantage to having a localist sort of consciousness when you're making decisions like that?
I think I've been incautious in my use of terms. Let me explain what I mean. I absolutely agree with you. The one thing that this is not about is about global government. Let me state first of all that I personally think that global government is an extremely bad idea. It's pretty obvious that government is effective in proportion to its closeness to the electorate. And so I'm generally very much in favour of devolution and things of that sort. I think that it's effective government is close to voters and is close to the ordinary lives of ordinary people. The further away it is, frankly, the more inefficient it becomes, and the tendency is for it to become brutalized and oversimplified. So when I say that I'm against localism, I don't mean that I'm against local engagement in the political process. Far from it, quite the opposite. I guess when I use the word localism, I mean it in the pathological sense. And when I talk about nationalism, I mean it in the pathological sense. Whether you're talking about nationalism or localism, there are two varieties. There's no question about it. I have no problem with people feeling ordinarily proud of where they come from. I am ordinarily proud of where I come from. I just happen to rank myself as a human being first, and a British citizen, and actually rather tragically, a European second, and a British citizen third. I'm going to have to revise that. But that's my personal take, and anybody can have different loyalties in different orders. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's only when it becomes belligerent and inward-looking, when people start to use their national or their local identity as a stick to beat other people with. It really only becomes a problem when people start believing that they're superior because of where they come from. That's when it starts getting problematic. Otherwise, it's absolutely fine. And I think that actually it's quite beneficial for people to feel proud of where they come from for innocent cultural, historical, landscape reasons. What could be more natural? I mean, nobody wants to feel that they don't belong anywhere. We all like to feel that we belong somewhere, that we've got a home. But it has to be benign. It's like any growth. It can be a malignant one or a benign one.
So, for example, in the House of Commons, do you think that each MP should vote on the basis of what would be best for their constituency, or what would be best for the nation overall?
Both.
What if they conflict?
Then we need to find solutions that don't conflict. And on many, many, many occasions, that's possible if you're in the right mindset and you're drawing on the right experience. Because you see, in theory, that's what an assembly like the House of Commons is supposed to do. They're supposed to find, that's why it exists. You've got people representing at a fairly narrow level local interests, but collectively they have to determine the correct balance between the good of the small number and the good of the whole number. That's the whole point of a parliament. And it's no accident that the British Parliament has been imitated all around the world. The problem is that in the age of globalization, it doesn't work terribly well, because it's not just the national interest, it's also the international situation, which impinges in absolutely everything now. And that, I think, is the area in which people are finding it increasingly difficult to find compromises, or better than compromises, the harmonization between those different needs that produces a better result. But those solutions are available. People just need to retrain. They need to understand, they need to develop a new form of policy making that enables that to be true. It's not always going to be true. There will always be conflicts here and there, but far less often than most people imagine, in my experience. So,
I just wanted to say thank you for your inspirational talk.
May I say thank you for smiling all the way through? It's so helpful when people.
No, I was like really nodding along because I fully agreed. It was very inspirational, and I feel like you're the embodiment of my hope and probably my naivety as well.
That's cool. We can be naive together.
But at the same time, there is that small little realist voice in the back of my head that says, what makes, as some of the sentiments echoed by some of my colleagues, what makes the political elite really want to listen to us? You look at the Iraq War, and that had a large anti-war. The United States and the fact that they haven't signed up to the Kyoto Protocol, or the fact that the latest climate change talk was almost didn't amass in much movement on it. So you think to yourself, states end up doing what they want to do anyway. So what would your movement really represent, and how would you?
It is really looking, because you're right. I was listening to somebody talking when the Chilcot report came out. For those of you who are familiar with it, I'm sure you all are. This was the report on the Iraq War. People mentioned the size of the protests against the Iraq War, and I'd forgotten. It was the largest protest that had ever been recorded in history. We had, I think, 4 million people on the street protesting against the Iraq War, and it was completely ignored by the policymakers. So your question, would this be any different, is a really interesting one. I hope so, and I'll tell you why. In the end, a single protest about a single piece of policy about which the decision has already been made is not going to have any immediate effect in most cases. What's missing here, I think, is a coherent, cohesive, underlying meme that can start impacting everything we do every day, and the whole political discussion. Because what's required here is not a change of policy, it's a change of culture. And changes of culture can take place. We've seen this happen before in many, many occasions. Is not to pick a fight with any individual politician. We're not trying to do a war here or a referendum there or anything of that sort, because in any case that means taking side, because I'm too far from the issues. What I'm trying to do here, and what I think we all need to try to do, is to introduce a new meme, a new way of looking at the world. This can be, and it ain't going to happen straight away, but in time we may find, just as the introduction of environmentalism and the introduction of feminism and other ideas of that sort have over time changed the agenda. They have changed the agenda. And once the agenda has changed and the culture has changed, then we'll find that politicians, the people in power, are starting to make different decisions. And they're making different decisions because they see which way the wind is blowing. And if politicians are good at anything, they're good at survival. And they're good at smelling what will keep them in office and what won't. So in the end, the only way that Tony Blair would have listened to 4 million people protesting against Iraq would be as if he genuinely believed that his possibility of remaining in number 10 Downing Street depended on that, but it didn't. And so he'd already made the decision, as we see. And so he was prepared for that. Maybe not for 4 million, but there was no possibility of him changing his mind as a result of public pressure. But if the whole culture has changed, then politicians won't even be making those decisions in the future, because they'll know that's not the way things are anymore.
Hi, my name is Lena, and well, first of all, I just want to thank you for all the nice things you said about Norway.
My pleasure.
Secondly, I think it's a long-term project because obviously nationalism is very ingrained in a lot of cultures. But I also think if you could just get the ball rolling, basically, and instead of Facebook, I would actually suggest Google,
right.
Because they have offices all over the world, but also they represent basically the internet, and which is about connecting people. And if that potentially is a possibility, then I would try that.
So you mean actually go into partnership with Google and do this together?
Yeah, potentially partnership, or I don't know, working.
They may not want to talk to me.
No, that is clear, but
No, but it's a point that has to be raised, because I think that, well, maybe we could do both. Maybe we could do Facebook and Google. The reality of the matter is that I have lots of these conversations all the time, and very often we come up with perfect partners or perfect funders or perfect this or perfect that. The reality is I'm just an ordinary guy and I'm not very well known. And for me to reach out to those organizations is just as difficult as it would be for any of you to do it. And I can't get through to them. So it may be a wonderful idea in principle, but actually in practice, I don't know anybody who works at Google. Well, a few little local offices, but I don't know the people who run it. And they get thousands and thousands and thousands of NGOs every day writing to them and saying, we've got the best idea, it's going to change the world, and we want to be your partners, and together we'll change the world. How would they know that I'm any different? So there's a real obstacle there. But in principle, you're absolutely right. This is perhaps the thing that we should aim for. I'm a little bit nervous about the idea of doing a deal with an organization like Google, because I don't think that I would stand very much chance of steering it in what I believe to be the right direction. I think the chances are that very, very quickly it will be steered in what their direction is, and they are in the end a commercial enterprise, and they need to make money, and that may not be always at odds with what we're trying to do, but I would have very little bargaining power. I'm just the guy that brought them the idea. So I'm nervous about doing things like that right now because we're very vulnerable. Later on, when we've got 100 million people voting in the US elections, then we've got a bit of power, and I can negotiate from a position of strength. At the moment, I'd be begging them, and I don't like to beg.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi Simon, my name is Ali, I'm from Australia, and I am so happy to have heard what you said today. Like, it's just music to my ears. It's everything I stand for. And I'm happy that there's someone out there with the same views. And I learned new things, and I completely agree, and I support the process that you're going and everything. And so I thought about, what could we do? I'm with you. And I thought, okay, so Facebook is a good way to sort of push an idea. And the best way to push an idea, learning from media, would be some kind of controversy.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's when it starts to become a little bit more fun, But at the same time, to get businesses involved, and these days, like, I'm a student of global business, and we're learning that a lot of businesses now are adapting corporate social responsibility. So if there is
and it's a very similar idea, by the way.
If there's a good cause, they're gonna sort of go along with it to increase their reputation.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's sort of a lot of companies are in their own personal interest, but in your case, so I thought maybe to raise some funds. I personally know someone that can develop an app for you, and they will do that for free.
Fantastic.
I'll get the details.
Accepted. Thank you.
I thought you can probably do a crowdfunding thing, but once you've done some kind of controversy, then you could say support us, and then from there we can slowly grow. So I agree with the dual mandate, and also.
You can just agree with everything.
I really want to be a part involved in it because.
That's great.
Yeah.
You are already.
I'm just. I'll get back to you on some more stuff later, but I'm just really happy.
Okay.
I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm very grateful to have heard everything you had to say.
Thank you, Ali. That's really, really lovely. Do you want to give it to this lady? Lovely to meet you. Let me just say two things very, very quickly. First of all, getting corporate sponsorship, I have no problem with that at all. As long as it's not a company that sells guns or maybe alcohol. I don't want to start that by alienating every Muslim in the world. But I think that there are plenty of companies who might find this interesting. The obstacle is the same one as our friend from Norway said, that actually I don't have any more ability to approach these companies and say, hey, do you want to toss us a few million than anybody else does? And what I've learned in my life is that reaching out to people almost always produces the wrong effect. Yeah. Nobody trusts their own judgment. And they'll say to themselves, well, this sounds like a good idea, but if he's reaching out to me, he must be a loser. And that tends to be what people's reaction is.
You shouldn't look at yourself in a negative position.
I don't, but they do.
I mean, it's sad that we're a minority, actually, the people that think like that. And the majority of people are just distracted with, with like just things that are going to entertain them.
But let's not go overboard with the idea of the minority, because 10%, remember I said, is the hardcore. That's the people who believe this 100%.
700 million, that's a lot of people.
And that's a big number.
If you estimate that, then those are the people that we should sort of be approaching and finding every way to get them more involved.
By the way, in the middle of the 10%, there's an even harder core, and that's the enormous number of people around the world who are of mixed race or mixed heritage. So one of the things, I am too, and one of the things that I wanted to do was to create something within the good country called Mongrels United, right? Which is anybody who feels that they are slightly more interesting than the average, either because they have, they come from 2 different races or 2 different religions or more than 2 or whatever. Those people, well, everybody knows how biology works, right? If you have 2 parents who are genetically exactly the same, you're much more likely to be stupider than them. Forgive me. Whereas stir up, there was a TED talk I gave in Amsterdam. If you're interested, I'll send you the link to it, where I talked about how the wisest thing ever said by any mortal person was Bob Marley, when he said, "Stir it up." Right? Because stirring up the gene pool, stirring up cultural influences, that's the good thing about globalization, because it creates so much more inspiration and so much more creativity. And the people who are themselves stirred up in some way, I mean, I don't want to diss the people who are of pure race, because they have their qualities too, but there's something particularly interesting about people whose identity is in some way conflicted. It may be that their parents are the same race, but they live in a different country.
We become global citizens when we're born, instantly.
This lady here has a question.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you, and thank you for being here. I'm Ivana from Kosovo, and I have a question about the global vote.
Yeah.
Do you think that the global vote can change the democracy of a country, and how?
I hope not, in the short term. Do you want to hand that to whoever wants to? One of the things that we're really, really clear about on the global vote, and this is a very important point that you raise, is that what we're not doing is interfering in the democratic processes of those countries. Because the agenda is very, very clear. We're only looking at what those politicians are going to do externally. We're only looking at foreign policy and international relations. So otherwise, frankly, it would be impossible, because the one thing I don't want people to do when they go to global vote is to start worrying about what these candidates are promising to do for their own people. That's none of our business, okay? So when we look at Sao Tome and Principe, and we've got one candidate saying that he's going to increase employment, and we've got another one saying he's going to allow the independence of Principe, can you believe it? Can you believe human nature? This tiny country on 2 tiny idyllic islands in the middle of a wonderful ocean, they want to split up. They're the smallest country on earth, virtually, and they want to be 2 even smaller ones. So this is tribalism for you. I don't know the issues. I'm being very unsympathetic. But there's another politician who wants to... All that kind of stuff, that's of no concern to us at all. That's domestic. That's their business. I always ask the candidates 2 questions, right? And the first question is, if you're elected president, what are you going to do for the rest of us? Right? The people who are not your voters, the people who don't live in your country, but who live around the world. That's question number 1. Question number 2, what is your vision for your country's role in the world? And those are the only questions that I want to ask the politicians, and they're the only questions that I want the global voters to consider, right? We leave it to the residents to decide on everything else. So far, we've had quite a bit of success actually getting a number of candidates to answer those questions, and they're having a lot of fun doing it. So at the moment, on average, it's 1 or 2 candidates in each election who will actually answer my email, and they realize that this is kind of cool, and they do have a message for the rest of the world. We are about to cover the rerun of the Austrian presidential election. Just a quick briefing on that in case you weren't aware. The President of Austria is due for reappointment. There was a very, very close competition between a far-right candidate called Norbert Hofer, who is from the same party that the rather notorious Jörg Haider was chief of until he passed away. This is a guy who campaigns with a pistol in his pocket. He's on record as saying that Islam is an evil religion. He wants to reduce immigration. He's very, very far right, and he very nearly won the presidency of Austria. So the head of state of a democratic Western European nation with views like that is a real, real change in the world, and a very, very worrying development in my opinion. Unfortunately, or rather fortunately, he won by a very narrow, the other candidate, who's a Green politician called Alexander van der Bellen, he won by a very, very narrow margin. Unfortunately, the election was declared invalid because there were some postal votes that switched the result at the very last minute, and Hofer's party declared it null and void, and the government agreed that it was, so they're now rerunning it. So the global vote is going to be covering the rerun of the presidential election. And I just heard today that we're going to get a personal comment from Alexander van der Bellen. I'm now in the interesting situation of trying to have a conversation with Norbert Hofer and see if he has a comment to make about what he sees as Austria's role in the world. He's already said he wants them to remain in the European Union. So it may be quite an interesting, nuanced point of view. It may not be as straightforward as we expect. But anyway, forgive me, I'm getting distracted, but the point is, it won't affect the democracy within that country. But what I hope it will do over time, and this is a long-term thing, we have to be patient, is it will affect the culture of democracy globally. What we're trying to do is we're trying to put these questions onto the agenda, so that gradually, every time we cover a country, we're adding a new square in a quilt. Yeah? We're creating a global flag, one country at a time, where we've asked the question. All that we're doing at the moment is asking the question, what will you do for the rest of the world? What's your international view? Gradually, one country after another, that question then will just hang in the air, and it'll just always be there. And eventually we'll get to the stage, I've already got some countries contacting me and saying, will you cover our election? I had a call from Ghana the other day. You've got an election coming up in November. At the moment we just do heads of state because that's the easy one. It tends to be a binary choice, or 8 or 9 people. I've got a problem. If anybody's got some thoughts about this, I'd love to hear it. How can we do assembly elections? I desperately wanted to cover the Australian election, but that would mean, this is an assembly, it's a parliament. So that would mean getting people in Japan interested in the personal details of 126 Australian MPs. This is not really very realistic. And the only shortcut to that is to get people in Japan or Guatemala voting on political parties in Australia, and I really don't want to do that because I don't believe in political parties.
You found companies that are trading with Australia, that have direct foreign investment within Australia, that have particular interest, and there's this financial motive, then you could probably suggest the index to them to check out.
Well, maybe, but that's not going to solve my basic problem of how we get people to vote on the Australian elections when it's the election of 126 people and not one. Because, for those of you who aren't aware, Australia works a little bit like the UK, that the leader of the victorious party becomes the head of government. And the head of state, unfortunately, unavailable because it belongs to Queen Elizabeth for the time being. But anyway, we'll figure that one out.
Okay, thank you so much. I've been waiting for this moment for so long. Okay,
that sounds like a song I once heard.
I'm really passionate about your idea. I'm actually, I heard it and I thought it was miraculous. Therefore, I'm going to criticize it.
Okay. Where are you from?
I'm from Costa Rica.
Yeah.
My name is Mariana. A few months ago, I wanted to contribute to Bernie Sanders' campaign. I'm from Costa Rica, but I have a lot of American friends, and obviously Costa Rica is really closely related to the United States more. So I tried to do it, but it wasn't possible. No one outside from the United States could contribute, not even with $10 or $20, which I was eager to give to his campaign, and I started wondering why. Because, obviously for a lot of different countries, the US from the people there, And what I came to realize is that making people from abroad, or giving them some voice for the national elections, can go wrong 3 different ways, and which I think European can, well, already now, can actually go wrong. First of all, the uninformed vote, because obviously people just want to vote. They don't really know about what's going on, but there's something that the candidate with the best marketing is going to win, like Brexit and UK.
So no different from real life in that respect.
Yes. So, and that brings me to the second problem.
Yeah.
How are we going to be sure that we are still we? How can we be sure that it's not going to be permeated with, I know, for example, if people start listening to you, obviously you're going to have some amount of power, and more people are going to want to have the access to that amount of power. So then you're going to have what you just told us that you don't want to have, like big companies trying to get inside of that. And the third one that I really don't have the slightest idea of how to fix is the digital divide. Because obviously this is going to be available only for people with access to the internet. Right. For the first two, I actually have suggestions that you mentioned. People tend to like or to want to do what they aren't still allowed to do. Yeah. So obviously for young people that cannot vote yet, it's going to be like really interesting to be able to vote, and not only voting, but voting for the destiny of people from abroad. That would be amazing for young people. And well, another obvious thing is that people that is studying international affairs or public policy, they're going to be interested in this sort of topics. And obviously also there are different organizations like AXIA and some other ones that may be interested in getting their students in this sort of activity. So yeah.
I've got very quickly. In terms of the digital divide, actually that's the one I'm least worried about. Right now, we can only get people voting if they have internet access. We are in contact with 300 million Africa by text. So there's absolutely no reason why there shouldn't be a text vote. When we need to cross it, we'll have the resources to cross it. The first two are more complex. And I think the thing that we're still missing is the motivation, the incentive. I think I absolutely share with you the concern that it's easy to imagine the kind of hardcore lunatics like us who would find this really exciting. You know, I find other countries exotic, and to me it's the most thrilling thing to get to know a new country and to do something and to reach out and to impact it even in a tiny way. Most people aren't like that. Most people really aren't. So what we need is we need the thing that will engage them, the thing that will make them understand and want to do this more than anything else. I'm really sorry, but that's where I have to leave it. Otherwise I'm going to be late for my next appointment and I will never be forgiven. But you have my email address. So anybody who hasn't asked a question or made a comment, or you want to continue what we were discussing earlier, then just write to me. As I say, judging by the number of people who I think might want to write to me, maybe 3 weeks before I answer rather than 2 weeks, but I promise I will.
Can you answer like tonight?
Can I what? Tonight? No. Thank you so much for your time.
Just a quick announcement, guys. So you've got